Guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about the unfortunate passing of the woman who we consider to be the princess of rock and roll, the daughter, the one and only daughter of the king of rock and roll, who many perceive to be the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. Lisa Marie Presley's passing yesterday at the age of 54. Um, it was weird, and she passed away in her California home in Calabasas. It was weird because 2 days ago she had just attended the Golden Globe Awards with her mother, and then at that award show they were saying that she felt that she looked weak, that she was hanging on to a friend that she was with, and that she was just weak, and it was from an apparent heart attack. As many people know, her father passed away in August of 1977, um, at a very early age as well, due to heart issues. And prior to that, her grandmother, um, Dolores Presley, also passed away in 1958, August of that year, also from heart issues. Her family struggled over the years with addiction. Her grandmother was um, known to be an alcoholic. Her father, of course, famously passed away not only from heart issues, but it was heart issues brought on from the use of drugs and other pill medications. Similarly to her late ex-husband, the king of pop, Michael Jackson. Their lives were, her father and her ex-husband's life were very similar. She would often say, she said in the interview with Oprah, that it was a fishbowl life. In other words, people always looking in. These two men were the two most famous men in the history of music, in a sense, and she was linked to both of them. She was married to her children's father, Danny Keough, for many years, and then she divorced him in 1995 in a very public marriage, like I previously mentioned, to Michael Jackson in the Dominican Republic, and then they appeared on the VMAs together, in which Michael said, and we referenced this in other videos about Michael. They said this wouldn't last, and they kissing each other. The infamous kiss at the VMAs that many people said was very uncomfortable. Even Lisa Marie herself said that it was very uncomfortable. She had actually had a further relationship with Michael when she met him, when he and his family performed in Vegas in the 1970s. Her dad, of course, after his 1968 comeback, was mostly involved in the Las Vegas Strip, made it the Las Vegas Strip famous, and reinvented himself as a Las Vegas show act, because by the time he came out of the army in the mid 60s, uh, music had kind of passed him by. It was after the British invasion, after Motown, rock and roll was different, and and because his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had always tried to keep him away from touring internationally and tried to keep him pigeonholed into these shitty type movies. He was even offered the role in 1961's West Side Story, and he turned it down. And Colonel Tom Parker turned it down. And because of Colonel Tom's legal status, Colonel Tom was not able to tour outside of the United States. He was a Dutch citizen. He wasn't an American. So because he was so in charge of Elvis's life, Elvis was never able to achieve that international status. So by the time he came out of the army in the late 1960s, he had no other choice but to perform in Vegas. So long story short, while he was performing in Vegas, his daughter was, like many kids our age at that time, a fan of the Jackson 5, and she got to see the Jackson 5 perform, and she even got to meet Michael in the 70s. Later on, they would meet each other again at a party. They would begin talking. They hit it off, and Michael and her got married. Now, the marriage, many people say, was a sham marriage, because Michael himself had gone through some pretty, uh, tough legal battles in 1993 prior to the marriage. Of course, we know the allegations. um, Jordy Chandler allegations. The father of Jordy Chandler, Evan Chandler, put against my MJ in '93. So many people felt that the marriage to Lisa Marie was just, including Lisa Marie's mother, Priscilla, felt that it was just a way to clean up the image of Michael Jackson as a child molester, and he was using Lisa Marie. But many people from from Michael's side felt that Lisa was kind of using Michael as well, because she was trying to, at that time, she was trying to launch a music career in, I think it was country and western music, and I guess she felt, being married to Michael Jackson and being uh, carried, at least in 1995 anyway, carried more cultural cachet than being Elvis's daughter. So then there was that story that the tabloids ran when Michael was married to her, that he was trying to summon her father through a seance, which was a really weird story. But by the time she did get her music career launched in 2003, um, uh, she was completely separated from me and moved on to marry Debbie Rowe, and he was himself doing other things, and they never really, at least publicly, addressed their relationship. There was rumors among MJ's camp that he was still in love with her, and that they remained in contact till his death. And I think she did reveal that in the Oprah interview. But in 2003, like I said, she launched her own career, and and she had this song, "Lights Out," on that album that I liked. Someone turned the lights out in Memphis, talking about when she was last with her father. She was actually with her father the night that he passed away in 1977. So, um, and she talks about in the Oprah interview how she anticipated Michael's death as well, because um, she she just saw him going down this terrible path of being used and abused by music associates. Again, when you are that famous, when you're on the level like her father, on the level like Michael, you are you don't have many friends, you don't have many allies, and there are very few people have been on that level of being the actual number one in the music business, and so famous that no matter where you go in this world, people will recognize you. And she had an amazing life, being associated and linked to both those people, and also being associated to one of the biggest legends in the Hollywood game. Also, a super fan of her father, the man who did um, the movie Viva Las Vegas, Nicolas Cage. He was married to her for a while, and then they divorced. But it was and then being married to Michael Lockwood after Nicolas Cage. It was interesting though that her first husband was with her, and he actually performed CPR when she passed away. You know, so you know they say you never really get over your first love. So I would imagine, I guess he was her first love. You know, it's just so sad because her family has suffered tremendous tragedies since even before the birth of her father. Even. You know what I mean? Because many people don't know this, but her father, Elvis Presley, when he was born in 1935, was a twin. and Elvis's brother Jesse Garin died while his mom was giving birth to both of them, and that kind of always haunted Elvis's life when he was growing up because his mom would always remind him that he was doing everything for two. She would kind of put the onus and the responsibility on him. So he always kind of felt guilty in a sense for his brother's death. Like if he wasn't born, maybe his brother Jesse Garin um, wouldn't have uh, passed away. So there was tragedy with that, and then there was tragedy, of course, the relationship between Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, and him. Vernon being locked up in the early part of being locked up in jail in the early part of Elvis's childhood when he was growing up in Tupelo, and then there was tragedy with her dad Elvis, and then there was tragedy with Michael Jackson, and then there was tragedy, crazy stuff with her and Nicolas Cage, crazy stuff with her being associated with Scientology, which many perceive L. Ron Hubbard's religion, which many people perceive, especially in the Hollywood world, many people perceive that as a cult. You know what I mean? Because we've seen, people like Leah Remini of King of Queens fame expose it. Other people that have left it, we saw how crazy it made Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes and other celebrities. That this was kind of L. Ron Hubbard's religion was kind of a cult, and she was associated with that. So a lot of people will probably look at that like some funny style stuff. You know what I mean? What was involved with the machinations of that? Was there any sort of conspiracy theories related to that? Because when it comes to Scientology, there's a bunch of conspiracy theories. When it comes to MJ, there's a bunch of conspiracy theories, including that he is not really dead. When it comes to her father, there's a bunch of conspiracy theories, including that he is not really dead either. So her life was kind of overshadowed by these mega big time celebrities and names that she was associated with. And her 2003 album was kind of, and the music career in general was kind of was overshadowed by that, including the death of her son, her first son. Her daughter right now, Riley Cano, is involved with modeling and singing too. You know what I mean? So that kind of carries on the Presley legacy. But so much drama and intrigue in the music business associated with this woman, and I put that she was the princess of rock and roll because many don't, well, at least it was going on. While many don't agree with that designation of her as her father as the king of rock and roll, because of the controversy that surrounds him, as far as like him coming into rock and roll later and the racial politics associated with rock and roll then and now, and cultural appropriation, and the kind of woke status that we all have now, will say, oh, well, he technically wasn't the king of rock and roll because there was other kings before him, other people that were African Americans doing it, and rock and roll was a primarily black genre before he got into it, and that's true. But I think that Elvis himself, if he were alive, and Lisa Marie, if she were alive, I don't think that they would say that he invented rock and roll. That was never the claim that he invented rock and roll. He himself, uh, in interviews, gave credit to the African American pioneers of rock and roll, like Big Joe Turner, like Little Richard, who I consider, to me, in my opinion, Little Richard to be the king of rock and roll. I don't think Elvis would say that he was the king of rock and roll. That was something more the media put on him, and that was something more his fans put on him. He never called himself the king of rock and roll. So, out of respect to her and out of respect to her father, I give her that title, even though I may not necessarily agree with it historically because it's not historically accurate. You know, it's like saying is Eminem the king of hip hop? No, but the thing is, if you ask Eminem, is he the king of hip hop? He would say that he is not the king of hip hop, just like Elvis would have said he's not the king of rock and roll. But the fans say that because you got to remember, rock and roll in and of itself is not a distinct genre. The name rock and roll comes from Alan Freed, a 1950s disc jockey or broadcaster, radio broadcaster from Cleveland, Ohio, who wanted to deracialize rhythm and blues because rhythm and blues on the Billboard chart since the 1940s was associated was associated with black music. Prior to being called rhythm and blues, it was called race music, and it was primarily, African American jazz and blues performers. So by the 1950s, a lot of white kids were getting into it, and Alan Freed wanted a way to deracialize the music. So he changed the name from rhythm and blues to rock and roll, which rock and roll, the word the phrase was originally a slang, an African American slang for sex. So it was not in and of itself a distinct genre of music. So nobody can really be the king of it. It was just basically um, African American rhythm and blues and white hillbilly music, Southern music. And you had primarily country music stars that were associated with like Johnny Cash or Carl Perkins or Jerry Lee Lewis, and yet other primarily African American stars like Chuck Berry and Big Joe Turner that were associated. But see, when Elvis came on the scene, he did both. He did the African American style. His first record that he ever released, the eight, because songs used to be in records. Like you would have two different sides of it. You would have an A side that was the A side of his first song was "That's Alright Mama" by Arthur Big Boy Crudup, a cover of that song, and the B side was "The Blue Moon of Kentucky" by Big Bill Monroe. So one was a country music cover, or hillbilly, what they call at that time a hillbilly cover, and the other was an African American cover. So he did both. He kind of combined both, and he brought the primarily black music of rhythm and blues to the white mainstream. So later historians would perceive him as the king of rock and roll, not he himself say that he was the king of rock and roll. Now, the controversy regarding Elvis being racist. Now, there was there was an article published in Ebony magazine in the 1970s in which Elvis was alleged to have said, "The only thing that a black man can do for me is shine my shoes." Now, later on, that claim came out that it was false, that that was a misprint, that he never really said that. And there were other rumors surrounding him that every time he saw a black guy on TV, he shot up the TV and broke it. I don't know if any of that was true. I do know that according to several of his biographers, um, he would get in trouble because he would sneak out of the white church, the primarily white church in both Tupelo, the city, see, the city in Mississippi where he was born and grew up in the projects around African Americans, and in Memphis. Uh, he would always associate with African Americans, so that was well known. You know what I mean? Whether or not he was racist, you can't really say the heart of a man. You know what I mean? You can't. You can only judge by his actions and what he did. Chuck Berry, I mean, excuse me, Chuck Berry, not Chuck Berry, Chuck D, the rapper we know from the 1989 song "Fight the Power," said, um, we know that infamous line, uh, "Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me." Uh, Straight out racist. The sucker was simple and plain. F him and John Wayne. Later, Chuck D, not Chuck Berry, Chuck D, later went redacted that statement, did his research further, and found out that no, Elvis never had any public incidents of racism as far as he could look up. John Wayne, however, did. So still fuck John Wayne. But it wasn't necessarily Elvis, but what he really represented to a lot of African Americans, which was the co opting of African American music. You know, the co opting of African American popular music, the co opting of rock and roll. The fact that not he himself never gave black people credit, but his fans never gave black people credit and sat there and acted like he invented rock and roll. And they kind of try to divorce, even now, the narrative of divorcing rock and roll from the African American musical experience, and they won't even act like the mothers and fathers of rock and roll were even black. You know what I mean? You see them trying to do that with hip hop nowadays. You know what I mean? You see them trying to say that Latinos were involved with Fat Joe and people like that, trying to say Latinos 50-50 created hip hop and 50-50 were involved with hip hop, when it's a fallacy of history. Although you might see pictures of Latinos involved with hip hop in the late 60s, early to mid 70s, the creators of hip hop, the true mother and fathers of hip hop, just like rock and roll, just like R&B, just like country music, and just like any form of American music, were all African American. You know what I mean? So when I use that title, King of Rock and Roll, or Princess of Rock and Roll, in reference to her, I don't mean to d- diminish or minimalize, uh, you know, the African American contributions to rock and roll music. I know, as a historian of American music and a historian of things in general, that black people created rock and roll. I know that black people are the mothers and fathers of rock and roll. That Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Son House and BB King and John Lee Hooker and all the people at Chess Records and all the people at Sun Records and all the blues artists. Those are the mothers and fathers of rock and roll. And what became rock and roll, what was under the label of rock and roll, the rubric of rock and roll. Louis Jordan and Jump Blues, all that stuff. What they call later rock and roll was invented by black people and comes out of the African American experience. There is no music in American culture that you can listen to that doesn't have African American influences, even country music. You know what I mean? Because you might say, oh, well, country music, the foundation of country music is Scots Irish culture and the Appalachian culture of the Presbyterian Scots Irish that came to America, before the American Revolution. Hold on.
Welcome to HHA King. Press 1 for calling. Press 2 for call out. Press 3 for enter assignment ID. You have entered 101101. If correct, press 1. Press 0 to re-enter. The current time is 1:01 p.m. Enter duty ID and press the pound key. Enter next duty ID. Enter next duty ID. Call registered. Goodbye.
Yeah, well, I was already doing it when you called. Okay, back. So yeah, you might say that the foundations of American country music come from the Scots Irish culture. And you would be correct, but at the same time, you got instruments like the banjo and other instruments that come directly from West African culture, particularly Senegalese. The Senegalese Gambia area. So when I say that she's the queen of, I mean, the princess of rock and roll, I don't mean to diminish anybody else's contributions. I know the history, but it's just what she's called, you know, and to show respect to her and her family, and that her and her family did contribute to the history of American music. And it was because of him, unfortunately, because of the way that America set up and the legacy and history of white supremacy in this country, it took a white face to make black music mainstream, at least in that time. In the late uh, 40s, early 50s. Later on, of course, that his revolution, what he did, would later pave the way for other African American artists to perform music in their own right, like Motown, like soul, like disco, and then like later hip hop and modern R&B that we see today. So, although he didn't start it because he was white, it took a white face to get into the door because white people don't, you know, uh, white people don't accept or didn't at that time anyway, um, a, a, a mainstream face being black because even Motown music that a lot of young white teens loved and enjoyed, still got covered by the Beatles, and those songs became 10 times popular when the Beatles did the cover of it than they would have if a blackface had done it. It's just the way that America is. You know what I mean? The legacy of white supremacy, the legacy of racism. It's unfortunate that um, even we see it with physical characteristics like a big butt or big lips. That now Kim Kardashian has it, and J Lo and other um, non-black people have it. It's more culturally acceptable. The same things that black people used to be ridiculed for are acceptable when a white person or a non-black person does it. When a black person did it, it was ridiculed and made fun of. You know what I mean? And that was the case. That's how it was with Elvis. You know. Yeah, Lisa says she was at the award show for the Elvis movie. Yeah, the Elvis movie that came out in 2022 about his life. Yeah, the relationship with Michael Jackson, we talked about that at least, but that was tumultuous. Many people say it was a fake relationship, but Michael's publicist always insisted that he was still in love with her. And many people say that the song that he came out with, One More Chance at Love, was secretly written about her. But because of what he was going through at that time, uh, you know, the relationship never really worked out. You know, so I mean, who knows if that was true that he was really secretly in love with her? I mean, we don't know because MJ's passed away too. So we don't know the intentions of a person. You know what I mean? If only we could read the minds of people that were passed away and know what they think and know what they feel. But unfortunately, only God can know that. You know what I mean? But it was hard for MJ to be in a relationship with a woman or with anybody because of he was, even if he were gay, you know what I mean? Like it would have been hard for him to be in a relationship because he's Michael Jackson. You know what I mean? He's the most famous photographed man on earth. Even more famous than her father because Elvis never was allowed to because who his manager was, he was never allowed to tour other countries. He's only really famous within the United States. So people might say, "Oh, Elvis is a bigger star than MJ," but MJ was a bigger star internationally because MJ was loved and known all around the world, whereas Elvis was really only really known and beloved within the United States and maybe England. You know what I mean? Because they speak the same language. And the influence that he had on on groups like the Beatles. So the only person that really surpasses her dad in popularity was Michael Jackson, and she was associated with him as well. And saw his downfall just as she had seen the downfall of her father. It's something that we always talk about in this channel. We talk about it all the time. We talked about it with DMX, with regard to Whitney Houston, with regard to Scott Hall, with regard to China, with regard to Britney Spears, the kind of pressure that we put on celebrities, and we think that their feelings and their emotions don't matter just because they're famous. We always that's a constant theme on this channel that we always talk about. We try to get people to realize that just because somebody's a public figure doesn't mean they don't hurt and they don't bleed like the rest of us. Did Elvis have eccentric personality traits that he was associated with? Sure, he did. Did MJ have that? Yeah, he did. Did either one of them have pedophilic predilections? We don't know about MJ, so that's a question mark. But we do know that unfortunately Lisa Marie's mother and Elvis were married when Priscilla was very young, 14 years old, and there was stories that um, Priscilla's dad sold um, her to Elvis. You know what I mean? So, but again, they were human beings. They they cried tears like the rest of us. They bled like the rest of us. And the thing is, too, these people had Michael Jackson and Elvis. They had leeches on them. They had people. Elvis had a group of people that he was associated with that were called the Memphis Mafia. This group of Memphis hangers on, bloodsuckers, leeches, um, that would take advantage of them financially. And they were just yes men. It was similar to what we heard about with MJ, where people didn't want to tell him no, even when he was doing things that were detrimental to his health. Both of them had private doctors. Elvis had Dr. Nick. MJ, of course, had Conrad Murray that we know about that was convicted of murder in his death. The people that didn't want to tell him no, people that always told them yes, and even when they didn't need to hear it. You know what I mean? Because of who they were and their status. You know what I mean? So um, both of them had brothers that died at a very young age. Of course, MJ's brother Randy was a twin. I think it was Randy. I think it was either Randy or Marlon. One of them was a twin, and the brother died at a young age uh, at birth. And of course, Elvis himself was a twin, and his brother died too at birth. So imagine being a twin in this world, being a twin and not having your twin sibling alive with you. Her father faced tremendous pressures. And I think she herself faced tremendous pressures because she always was in the shadow of those two famous men. Like whenever she would go on interviews with Oprah, people would either ask her about MJ or they would ask her about her dad. And her own personal achievements were never acknowledged. That she ever did anything beyond just be the ex-wife of Michael Jackson and the daughter of Elvis. And she had a musical soul herself. She had a musical personality herself, but that was never able to blossom into what it should have. You know what I mean? So anyway, rest in peace to Lisa Marie Presley. Condolences to her family and to her fans. Like I said, her album, her song "Lights Out" is still one of my favorite songs. You know what I mean? Because I can't imagine a girl and her birthday was just about to come up on the 1st of February. Um, so she would have turned 56 and she lived a couple of weeks later. Anyway, thank you guys for contributing. Love you guys. Thank you, Lisa, again for contributing. And rest in peace to another Lisa Marie Presley.